There are moments in life when a bond with another person becomes so deeply woven into our inner fabric that it feels impossible to loosen it without tearing ourselves apart. Yet Carl Jung understood that detachment is not about cutting ties with violence or suppressing feelings with coldness. It is about withdrawing projections, reclaiming the parts of ourselves we unconsciously gave away, and stepping back into the quiet ground of the self. To detach without pain is to learn how to see the other not as a piece of your own soul that you cannot live without, but as a fellow traveler on the path of becoming whole. Jung often reminded us that what we cling to most desperately in another person is usually the reflection of something unrecognized within ourselves. The intensity of attachment is not only about love or affection, it is often the pull of shadow and anima or animus, drawing us to someone who carries what we have not yet claimed in our own being. To detach, then, is to recognize the hidden exchange. When we see that we have been trying to live through another, when we realize that the fire we thought belonged to them is also burning quietly within us, the grip begins to loosen. The first movement of detachment is not external but internal. Jung's philosophy insists that real separation begins in the psyche. To end an attachment with less pain, one must withdraw the unconscious projections that bind us. This means slowly retrieving our ideals, our fears, our unspoken longings that we have cast upon the other person. As long as those projections remain, we are not simply missing a human being, we are missing the part of ourselves we handed over. The work of detachment is the work of inner retrieval, a calling back of our own essence. There is also the recognition of temporality. Jung saw life as a series of psychological seasons, each relationship serving a purpose within the great unfolding of individuation. To detach is not to diminish what has been shared but to see that its time has passed. Just as the leaves fall in autumn not because the tree has failed but because a deeper cycle of renewal requires release, so too does the soul release its attachments when the lesson is learned. By aligning with this natural rhythm rather than resisting it, pain transforms into understanding. Yet detachment does not mean indifference. Jung spoke of love as the great mystery, the force that leads us beyond our own narrowness. To detach without pain requires holding love in a purified form, free from possession, free from the demand that the other must remain. It is the movement from eros to agape, from longing to reverence. The bond does not disappear, it is transfigured. The other remains within us as an image of what awakened us, a memory that need not wound, but rather guide us deeper into our own wholeness. We also find detachment in the acceptance of suffering itself. Jung believed that suffering, when consciously endured, leads to transformation. What creates unbearable pain is not the loss itself but the refusal to accept it. By allowing grief to wash over us without resistance, the sharp edges soften. Pain becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. Detachment does not mean escaping all sorrow, it means carrying it in such a way that it no longer paralyzes us. Another key is found in Jung's idea of individuation. Every attachment, no matter how consuming, ultimately points us back to our own unfinished self. We may believe we cannot live without the other because they embody what we lack, but this is precisely the sign that individuation is calling. To detach is to step onto the path of becoming whole, to cultivate within ourselves the strength, the tenderness, the imagination, or the courage we once sought outside. What once was dependency becomes a gateway to self-realization. As the work deepens, silence becomes essential. Jung often emphasized the healing power of solitude, the necessity of retreat in order to integrate what has been scattered. To detach without pain requires moments of stillness where we allow the psyche to reorder itself. In the quiet, we feel the pull of the old bond lessen. In the quiet, we remember that the ground of being is within us, not outside. The silence is not emptiness, it is where the self speaks. And so the process of detachment is not a violent tearing but a gentle unfolding. It is not repression, nor denial, nor bitterness. It is the slow recognition that what you thought was outside has always lived within. To detach is to take back the fragments of your soul, to thank the other for carrying them for a time, and to continue your journey with greater wholeness. It is the art of letting go without closing your heart, of releasing without forgetting, of moving forward without leaving yourself behind. This is the beginning of understanding Jung's keys to detachment. It is not a single act but a lifelong practice, one that allows us to meet others without clinging, to love without fear, and to walk away without losing ourselves. The road continues, and in every step, we discover that what we thought we lost has only returned home. Detachment, in Jung's sense, is never about severing our humanity. It is about reclaiming our psychic balance so that no relationship consumes the totality of our inner life. When an attachment grows too strong, it creates what Jung called participation mystique, a condition where two lives become entangled as though they were one organism. The self becomes blurred, boundaries dissolve, and the other person begins to carry our unlived life for us. This is why letting go feels like death. What is dying is not only the relationship but also the illusion that we could escape our own work by merging with another. To move through this without unbearable pain, one must begin to re-establish the boundary between I and you. Jung saw the self as the axis of wholeness, the deep center that grounds us no matter what storms rise in relationships. By returning again and again to that center through reflection, dreams, writing, or inner dialogue, we begin to see that the bond does not define us. It shapes us, yes, but it does not contain the totality of who we are. The recognition of our own independent ground is one of the keys to detachment that heals rather than wounds. The psyche will resist. It clings to what feels familiar, even if the bond has become destructive. Jung taught that the unconscious often prefers repetition to growth, because repetition protects us from the terror of the unknown. The familiar pain of attachment seems safer than the open space of letting go. But detachment is precisely the movement into that unknown, and it requires courage. The unconscious will try to lure us back into longing, into memory, into fantasy. To detach means to face these images without acting on them, to let them rise and fall like waves without being pulled back out to sea. Here lies another key, the symbolic attitude. Jung urged us to approach psychic experience not only literally but symbolically. If a person has left your life, it is not only a personal loss but also a symbol. It may represent the end of a stage of your inner development. It may reveal the archetype of death and rebirth moving through you. By viewing the loss symbolically, you enlarge the meaning. You are not only losing someone, you are being initiated into a greater depth of being. When the personal shifts into the archetypal, pain transforms into awe. Dreams often become vivid in times of separation. Jung paid close attention to these images because they carry the psyche's guidance. In dreams, the figure of the person we are trying to detach from may continue to appear. Rather than interpreting this as a sign to return, Jung would see it as the psyche's way of working through the projection. These dream figures are not the actual person but the living symbols of what they carried for us. Engaging with them consciously allows us to reclaim the energy that was invested in the bond. Thus, detachment is not abandonment but integration. Another path Jung emphasized is the balance of opposites. If attachment has overwhelmed you, it means that one side of the psyche has dominated. Perhaps it was longing, perhaps dependency, perhaps idealization. To restore balance, one must call forth the opposite. If you have been consumed by desire, you must cultivate restraint. If you have been paralyzed by dependency, you must practice independence in small but steady ways. Detachment without pain comes through this balancing act, not through sudden rejection of the bond but through slowly building the counterweight within. The role of the shadow cannot be ignored. Jung made it clear that often we cling to another because they embody the qualities we have disowned. If we are timid, we may cling to the bold. If we are disorganized, we may cling to the orderly. If we are afraid of our own sensuality, we may cling to someone who carries it with ease. Detachment requires shadow work. It requires the humility to see that what we loved or even envied in the other is also waiting to be awakened in us. By taking back the shadow qualities, the magnetic pull lessens. What once seemed impossible to release begins to fade into freedom. There is also the matter of the soul's calling. Jung believed that each life has an inner direction, a unique path of individuation. Attachments can either support or obstruct this path. When a bond becomes too consuming, it pulls us away from our deeper vocation. To detach without bitterness, we must see the departure not as abandonment but as redirection. Life is guiding us back to our own task, the task only we can fulfill. When seen this way, loss becomes a summons rather than a punishment. In time, the fire cools. The psyche, once agitated, begins to reorganize itself around the self. Detachment does not happen overnight, but through patient endurance, something remarkable occurs. The other person no longer dominates the inner horizon. They remain as a part of your story, a chapter you cannot erase, but they no longer hold the pen. You begin to sense your own authorship again, the ability to write new pages without their presence. This is not indifference, it is maturity. And so the process continues, not in sudden leaps but in subtle shifts of consciousness. Detachment becomes less about losing someone and more about finding yourself. It is the quiet recognition that your soul is large enough to contain both love and loss without being shattered by either. This realization does not erase grief, but it dissolves its tyranny. What remains is freedom, and within that freedom, the possibility of a deeper, truer love that does not bind but liberates. Detachment, when understood through Jung's philosophy, is a sacred transition rather than a violent break. It is the crossing of a threshold where one learns to hold memory without being enslaved by it. The heart does not forget, but the psyche learns to carry what once was in a new form. Jung often spoke of the psyche's capacity for transformation, of how pain, when faced consciously, can alchemize into wisdom. In the alchemy of detachment, longing is transmuted into insight, and absence becomes an opening toward a deeper relationship with the self. One of the most powerful forces in this process is what Jung called active imagination. When the bond with someone feels unshakable, the psyche continues to revolve around their image. Instead of repressing this, Jung encouraged engaging with it consciously. To sit in solitude, to allow the image of the person to arise, and to speak with them inwardly. To ask what they symbolize, what lesson they carry, what part of you they reflect. This practice brings the unconscious material into dialogue rather than letting it fester in the shadows. Over time, the figure loses its obsessive grip and becomes integrated as a living inner symbol rather than an external dependency. Another key lies in accepting the paradox of love and freedom. Jung knew that the human heart longs to bind itself, to unite, to merge. Yet individuation requires separation, the maintenance of distinct centers of consciousness. To detach without pain is to honor both truths at once. It means acknowledging that the love was real and that it shaped you, while also affirming that your wholeness cannot be outsourced. The paradox is not solved but carried, like a vessel that can hold both water and fire without being destroyed. Time plays its role too, but time alone is not enough. Jung made clear that unconscious suffering does not heal with time, it only buries itself. What heals is conscious suffering, the willingness to stay awake to the grief rather than numbing it. Each moment of awareness becomes a thread, slowly weaving a new pattern in the psyche. Days pass, seasons shift, and the intensity diminishes, but only because it has been lived through. Detachment without pain is not detachment without sorrow, it is detachment without denial. There is also the subtle danger of displacement. When trying to detach, many people rush into new attachments, mistaking replacement for healing. Jung warned of this, because unintegrated projections simply shift from one figure to the next. The faces change but the pattern repeats. True detachment requires a pause, a willingness to stand in the empty space before filling it again. This is where the soul breathes, where the psyche reorganizes, where the self has room to emerge. Without this pause, the cycle of clinging and loss continues endlessly. In this pause, solitude reveals itself as a medicine. Jung did not see solitude as isolation but as a return to the source. In solitude, we remember the voice within that was often drowned out by the noise of attachment. We begin to hear our own thoughts not as echoes of the other, but as authentic expressions of the self. What once felt like emptiness slowly becomes presence, the quiet radiance of being alone without being lonely. Solitude becomes the soil in which the seed of freedom germinates. The practice of ritual also plays a role. Jung was deeply aware of the psyche's symbolic needs. To end a bond without ritual leaves the unconscious restless, still waiting for closure. Ritual can be as simple as writing a letter never sent, as contemplative as lighting a candle, or as personal as creating a symbolic act of release. These gestures speak the language of the unconscious, marking the transition not only with reason but with symbol. In ritual, the psyche recognizes that the chapter has ended, and the work of detachment is honored. A further dimension arises when we consider Jung's insight into the collective unconscious. Every attachment is not only personal but archetypal. Lovers embody eternal patterns, friends reflect ancient bonds, conflicts mirror mythic struggles. To detach is to release not only an individual but also the archetypal force that animated the relationship. Seeing this broadens our perspective. What feels like a purely personal wound becomes part of the great human drama, shared across time and culture. This recognition does not erase the pain but situates it in something larger, making it more bearable. Eventually, the psyche discovers that detachment is not an end but a transformation of relationship. The person no longer exists in your daily life, but they live within you in a new form. They become an inner figure, a symbol, a remembered presence that contributes to your wholeness without dominating it. Jung saw this as a natural outcome of individuation. What once was outer becomes inner, what once was consuming becomes integrated. The bond does not vanish, it matures into a quieter strength. And so, step by step, detachment becomes less about losing and more about carrying. It becomes less about separation and more about integration. In this way, the pain does not harden into bitterness but softens into wisdom. You walk forward with the memory intact, but no longer as a weight dragging you down. Instead, it becomes a companion of the soul, a reminder of what you have endured and of the deeper wholeness that you are still becoming. Detachment in Jung's philosophy gradually shifts from being a struggle of the heart to a transformation of the entire personality. In the beginning, the challenge is raw and emotional, but as the process deepens, it becomes spiritual. To let go without pain is not merely to reduce sorrow but to be reshaped by it. The loss of another becomes the call to rediscover the self in its fuller form. Jung knew that what we release in the outer world must be taken back inward. The other person was never just themselves to us. They were an image carrying our unlived possibilities. To detach is to welcome those possibilities home. This return to the self is not accomplished through avoidance. Jung spoke of the danger of repression, of trying to silence longing through denial. Repression does not liberate. It buries the energy underground, where it festers, creating dreams of obsession, sudden outbursts, or physical illness. True detachment does not close the door violently but opens a new one inward. The feelings are acknowledged, lived, and then transformed. This is why Jung described individuation as a process of assimilation, not escape. You do not cut away what was part of your life. You take it in, digest it, and let it nourish the deeper layers of your being. There is a moment in this path where one feels suspended between worlds. The old bond has loosened, but the new ground has not fully formed. Jung would call this the liminal state, the in-between where transformation takes place. It can feel disorienting. The absence of the other creates a silence that at first seems unbearable. Yet it is precisely in this silence that the unconscious reveals new images, new stirrings, new directions. If one can endure this threshold without rushing back into old patterns, the self begins to rise more clearly, like a figure emerging from the mist. One of Jung's great insights is that the psyche never loses what it has once experienced. Every relationship, every bond, every love becomes part of the inner mosaic. Detachment does not erase, it integrates. The other person becomes an inner figure, one among many, shaping the texture of the soul. To detach without pain is to see this not as a diminishment but as an enrichment. Life does not take away. It transforms outer encounters into inner resources. In this way, even those who leave us remain as part of our psychic wholeness. Another step is the cultivation of what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Detachment requires carrying two truths at once. On one hand, you may still feel longing, memory, or even grief. On the other hand, you are moving toward freedom, toward independence, toward wholeness. Instead of forcing yourself to choose one side, Jung urged the patient endurance of both. By holding the tension without collapsing into either clinging or denial, something new emerges. This new third possibility, which he called the transcendent function, is the breakthrough of a deeper meaning, a higher state of consciousness born from the conflict itself. It is in this higher state that forgiveness often arises. Forgiveness, in Jung's sense, is not moralistic but archetypal. It is the recognition that both you and the other were instruments in the unfolding of a greater process. Each carried projections, each embodied shadows, each played a role in the drama of individuation. To forgive is not to excuse, but to see with symbolic vision. It is to recognize that the encounter, with all its pain and beauty, was necessary for your growth. Forgiveness dissolves bitterness, leaving only gratitude for the mystery of transformation. The psyche also finds relief in creativity. Jung valued painting, writing, carving, and all acts of symbolic expression as ways of channeling psychic energy. When an attachment loosens, there is a surge of energy that once flowed toward the other person. If not redirected, it becomes restlessness or despair. But when expressed creatively, it transforms into meaning. Art becomes a vessel for the unspoken, giving form to what cannot yet be fully understood. In this way, detachment births creation, and what once felt like pure loss becomes the source of new life. Spiritual experience often follows. Jung was careful not to impose any single religion, but he saw the numinous as essential. When we lose someone we were bound to, we often touch the sacred dimension of existence. Questions of fate, destiny, and meaning press upon us. To detach without pain requires not shrinking from these questions but allowing them to deepen us. The loss of a person can awaken the sense of something greater moving through our lives. In this sense, detachment opens a door to the archetype of the self, which is both personal and divine. Gradually, the psyche arrives at a state of inner spaciousness. The figure of the other is no longer dominant, the wound no longer fresh, the longing no longer unbearable. What remains is a calm recognition of the bond's place in the whole story of your becoming. You can think of the person without being consumed, you can remember without despair. The love has not been destroyed but transfigured. It lives on as part of your own depth, no longer as an external hold. And so, detachment in Jung's vision is not an ending but an initiation. It is the slow movement from projection to integration, from dependency to wholeness, from pain to wisdom. What once felt like being torn apart reveals itself as the very path by which you are made whole. It is the paradox of individuation that through letting go of another, you come closer to yourself. And in coming closer to yourself, you also come closer to life in its fullest and deepest form. Detachment in Jung's thought reaches its final stage not in absence but in reconciliation. It is the realization that nothing truly leaves us. Every person we have loved, every bond we have formed, becomes part of the inner totality. To detach without pain is to live in this realization, where relationships no longer hold us captive but live within us as integrated fragments of the self. The one who once seemed indispensable has become an inner companion, transformed from an outer presence into a symbol of growth. This is not loss, it is completion. At this point, the soul has moved beyond the desperate clinging of the early stages. The intensity of longing has softened into memory, the sharp edges of grief have smoothed into understanding. Jung would say that the projection has been withdrawn, the image reclaimed. What you once saw only in the other has been taken back into yourself. You no longer need them to carry it for you, because you now embody it. This is the essence of individuation, the movement toward becoming whole. Such detachment does not erase love. Instead, it purifies it. Love becomes free of possession, free of demand, free of fear. It becomes what Jung called the union of opposites, where eros and agape, longing and reverence, passion and freedom can coexist. You can think of the other with warmth without the ache of dependence. You can wish them well without needing their presence. Love that once bound now liberates. There is also the recognition of destiny. Jung believed that the psyche has its own innate direction, and every encounter is part of that unfolding. To detach without pain is to trust that what has ended has done so because the soul requires a new horizon. It is to see that the path continues, that the journey of individuation is still calling you forward. The relationship was not a mistake, nor is its ending a failure. Both belong to the same mysterious design. This trust transforms regret into acceptance, and acceptance into peace. As this peace deepens, the fear of being alone dissolves. What once felt like emptiness is now fullness. The self has become a living presence, guiding, holding, and sustaining. You no longer search outside for what you thought you lacked. You carry it within, and because of this, future relationships are approached differently. They are no longer desperate attempts to fill a void but conscious encounters between whole beings. Detachment has taught you that you can love without losing yourself, that you can give without clinging, that you can walk away without despair. In this way, detachment becomes not the end of relationship but the transformation of relationship. The person remains, but now as a part of your inner world, a figure in your personal mythology, a contributor to your wholeness. Their absence in the outer world no longer wounds because their presence in the inner world has been secured. This is how Jung understood the psyche's great gift: nothing essential is ever truly lost. It is carried inward, transmuted, and woven into the fabric of the self. And so, the final key to detachment without pain is gratitude. Gratitude not in the superficial sense of forcing positivity, but as a profound recognition that the bond has served its purpose. Gratitude for what was given and for what was taken. Gratitude for the suffering that carved out new space within you. Gratitude for the freedom that followed. Gratitude for the self, which held you through the passage and revealed itself more fully in the letting go. In the end, detachment is not an act of coldness, nor a denial of love, but a deep bow to the mystery of connection and release. It is the art of carrying others within us without being bound by them. It is the recognition that every bond, no matter how fleeting, contributes to the great work of individuation. And it is the quiet assurance that in learning to let go, we do not lose but become more fully ourselves. This is the culmination of Jung's vision. Detachment without pain is not about forgetting, it is about remembering rightly. It is about living with open hands, allowing love to come and go, while remaining rooted in the eternal ground of the self. From this place, no loss is final, no absence unbearable, no goodbye absolute. What was outside returns within, and the soul continues its journey, whole, free, and unbroken.